When Giacomo Ridere arrived in town, the sound of children's laughter would fill the streets for exactly one night. By dawn, an eerie silence would settle over the city, and the children would never laugh again. Some said he collected their joy in tiny glass bottles that tinkled like wind chimes. Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you in the comments. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from all corners of the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft hum in the background. And let's begin our journey together tonight. The first person to notice the stranger was young Marco Benedetti, the baker's son, who had risen before dawn to help his father prepare the day's bread. As he carried warm loaves through the narrow alleyways that connected the bakery to the main square, he caught sight of an unusual figure setting up what appeared to be a traveling theater in the very heart of Venetia's central piazza. The man was tall and impossibly thin, dressed in clothes that seemed to shift color in the early morning light, sometimes appearing deep purple, other times shifting to midnight blue, as if woven from twilight itself. What struck Marco most profoundly was not the stranger's unusual appearance, but his absolute silence. While other traveling performers typically announced their arrival with fanfare, music, and boisterous calls to attract audiences, this man worked with the quiet precision of someone conducting a sacred ritual. His movements were deliberate and graceful, each gesture flowing into the next as he assembled an elaborate puppet theater that seemed far too complex to have been transported by a single person. The puppet theater itself was a marvel of craftsmanship that defied conventional understanding of traveling entertainment. Carved from wood so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The structure stood nearly 8 feet tall and stretched 12 feet across. As the morning progressed and word spread through Venetia's winding streets, curious residents began to gather around the mysterious theater. The stranger, who would later introduce himself as Giacomo Ridere, continued his preparations with the same methodical silence that had marked his initial setup. He arranged rows of small wooden chairs in a semicircle before his stage, each chair carved with the same dark wood and bearing decorative elements that matched the theater's elaborate design. By midday, word of the remarkable puppet theater had reached every corner of Venetia, and the city's children had begun to congregate in the piazza with an enthusiasm that surprised their parents. Children who typically required coaxing to complete simple chores abandoned their responsibilities without protest. Drawn to the theater by what seemed to be magnetic attraction, they sat in the wooden chairs with unusual patience, their eyes fixed on the closed curtains that concealed the stage, waiting for a performance that had not yet been announced. Giacomo himself remained an enigma throughout these preparations. When spoken to directly, he would nod politely and smile, but his responses were limited to gestures and expressions rather than words. Several residents attempted to engage him in conversation about his origins, his travels, and his intentions for the evening's entertainment, but he seemed either unable or unwilling to provide verbal answers. His silence was not hostile or unfriendly. Rather, it carried the quality of someone who had forgotten how to speak, or perhaps had chosen to abandon speech in favor of more direct forms of communication. The most persistent questioner was Father Antonio Blessed, Venetia's elderly priest, whose responsibilities included evaluating any potential spiritual threats that might arrive in his parish. The priest approached Giacomo during the afternoon preparations, speaking in Latin, Italian, and even attempting French and German in hopes of establishing communication. Giacomo's responses were uniformly courteous but nonverbal, consisting of elaborate bows, graceful hand gestures, and expressions that seemed to convey understanding without providing any actual information. What disturbed Father Antonio most deeply was his inability to determine whether Giacomo was genuinely mute or simply choosing silence for reasons of his own. The stranger's eyes held intelligence and awareness that suggested full comprehension of spoken language, yet something in his demeanor implied that speech itself had become foreign to him. When the priest made the sign of the cross, Giacomo neither recoiled nor responded with recognition, maintaining the same pleasant, expectant expression that characterized all his interactions. As evening approached, the atmosphere in the piazza began to shift in ways that the adults found increasingly uncomfortable, while the children seemed to grow more excited with each passing hour. The air itself seemed to thicken, carrying scents that belonged to no identifiable source, sometimes resembling fresh flowers, other times evoking memories of childhood summers that felt more vivid than current reality. Several parents attempted to call their children home for dinner, only to discover that their usual authority had somehow become ineffective against their offspring's unprecedented determination to remain near the puppet theater. The children's behavior during these hours would later be described by their parents as simultaneously familiar and completely foreign. They remained recognizably themselves in terms of appearance and basic personality, yet they displayed a focused intensity that none had exhibited before. They spoke quietly among themselves, but their conversations seemed to center entirely on speculation about the coming performance. More remarkably, they showed none of the restlessness, bickering, or attention-seeking behavior that typically characterized groups of children forced to wait for extended periods. When the cathedral bells announced the arrival of sunset, Giacomo finally broke his day-long silence. His voice, when it came, was neither particularly deep nor high, but carried a musical quality that seemed to resonate not just in listeners' ears, but throughout their entire bodies. He spoke in Italian that was perfectly grammatical, yet carried an accent that suggested origins far from any region the Venetians could identify. His announcement was simple and delivered with the same graceful precision that had marked all his previous actions. The performance would begin when the last light faded from the western sky. The show was intended specifically for children, though adults were welcome to observe from a respectful distance. The entertainment would continue until its natural conclusion, which he could not predict with certainty. Most importantly, he requested that the audience allow the performance to unfold without interruption, as the magic he hoped to create required complete attention and cooperation from everyone present. The word magic sent a ripple of unease through the assembled adults, though the children received this information with evident delight. Father Antonio stepped forward to inquire about the nature of this magic and whether it conflicted with Christian doctrine, but Giacomo had already returned to his preparations, once again embracing the silence that had characterized his presence throughout the day. As darkness settled over Venetia's central piazza, torches were lit around the puppet theater, creating a circle of warm, flickering light that transformed the space into something that felt separate from the surrounding city. The children took their seats with ceremony that seemed far too sophisticated for their ages, arranging themselves in the wooden chairs with the precision of an experienced audience attending a performance of great significance. The adults, following Giacomo's suggestion, gathered at a distance that allowed them to observe while respecting the children's privileged position as the evening's primary audience. Parents found themselves experiencing emotions they could not easily explain, pride in their children's unusual behavior mixed with anxiety about circumstances that felt beyond their control or understanding. When Giacomo finally took his position behind the puppet theater, the transformation that occurred was so subtle that observers initially questioned whether anything had actually changed. Yet somehow the space within the circle of torchlight had become a world unto itself, governed by rules that differed from those that applied to everyday reality. The air shimmered with possibilities that extended far beyond the scope of conventional entertainment. The curtains opened with a whisper of silk against wood, revealing a stage that seemed impossibly deep, despite the theater's modest size. The first puppet to appear was a figure dressed as a court jester, complete with bells that tinkled with each movement. Yet this jester carried himself with dignity rather than foolishness, moving across the miniature stage with the grace of a dancer and the presence of a king. What followed was unlike any puppet show that anyone in Venetia had ever witnessed. The marionettes moved with fluidity that suggested life rather than manipulation, their wooden features expressing emotions with subtle changes that seemed to occur independent of any mechanical mechanism. The story they enacted was both familiar and unprecedented, a tale of a jester who had lost his own ability to laugh and traveled the world seeking to understand the nature of joy. As the performance progressed, something remarkable began to happen among the child audience. Their laughter, which had begun as normal responses to the puppet's antics, gradually took on qualities that surprised their parents. The sounds they made seemed richer, more musical, carrying harmonies and depths that no child's voice should have been able to produce. Individual giggles blended into a collective symphony of mirth that filled the piazza with sound unlike anything the adults had ever heard. Yet even as the children's laughter grew more beautiful and complex, Giacomo himself remained perfectly silent. His manipulation of the puppets was masterful. His storytelling through movement and gesture was captivating, but not once during the entire performance did any sound emerge from his own lips. He worked his magic, for magic it surely was, in complete silence, as if his role was to create opportunities for joy rather than to participate in the joy itself. The performance reached its climax when the Jester puppet encountered a group of children puppets who offered to share their laughter with him. As this scene unfolded on the miniature stage, the real children in the audience responded with waves of merriment that seemed to lift their voices beyond normal human ranges. Their laughter became music, then something that transcended music, filling the night air with pure distilled happiness that touched every adult observer with memories of their own forgotten childhood joys. When the curtains finally closed, the silence that followed was profound and complete. The children sat in their chairs with expressions of satisfaction so deep it resembled the contentment of people who had just experienced something that would sustain them for years to come. The adults found themselves blinking as if awakening from dreams, trying to process an experience that challenged their understanding of what puppet shows could accomplish. Giacomo emerged from behind his theater to accept the applause that erupted from both children and adults. His bow was elaborate and graceful, acknowledging not just appreciation for his performance, but recognition of something significant that had been shared among everyone present. Yet still he remained silent, his smile conveying gratitude while his eyes held depths that suggested experiences far beyond the scope of normal human existence. As the audience began to disperse, parents calling their children home to beds that were already hours overdue, Giacomo began the process of dismantling his theater with the same methodical precision that had marked its assembly. The wooden chairs were stacked and secured, the puppets were carefully returned to their individual containers, and the theater itself was broken down into components that could be transported by a single person. But the magic of the evening lingered in Venetia's streets long after the last torch had been extinguished. Children walked home with their parents in unusual silence, not from tiredness, but from a sense of completion that made words unnecessary. Adults found themselves humming melodies they could not identify, tunes that seemed to emerge from the evening's experience rather than from any songs they had previously known. It was only the following morning that the true nature of Giacomo's gift would begin to reveal itself, and the residents of Venetia would understand that they had been witness to something far more significant than entertainment. The silence that had characterized the stranger's presence would soon extend to their own children, and the laughter that had filled the piazza would become a memory preserved in forms that no one could have anticipated. The first morning after Giacomo Ridere's performance dawned with an unnaturally quiet stillness that seemed to muffle even the usual sounds of daily life in Venetia. The harbor bells rang as always. The merchants began their daily routines, and the cathedral announced the morning prayers, yet something fundamental had changed in the city's acoustic landscape. It took several hours for the residents to identify what was missing, and when they finally understood, the realization sent waves of concern through every household that had children. The children of Venetia had stopped laughing. Not just laughing, in fact, but making any sounds of joy or amusement whatsoever. They spoke when spoken to. They responded to questions with appropriate answers. They completed their assigned tasks with unusual efficiency and cooperation. Yet when presented with circumstances that should have provoked giggles, chuckles, or delighted squeals, they remained silent. More unnervingly still, they seemed content with this silence, showing no signs of distress or awareness that anything had changed. Marco Benedetti's mother was among the first to notice the transformation. As she prepared the morning meal, she had attempted to tease her son about his enthusiasm for the previous evening's puppet show, expecting the usual bashful grins and protests that such conversations typically provoked. Instead, Marco had smiled politely and continued eating his breakfast with a calm that belonged more to an adult than to a 12-year-old boy who had always been quick to laughter and mischief. Similar scenes played out throughout Venetia, as parents discovered that their children's responses to humor, play, and even gentle tickling produced smiles but never the sounds of merriment that had previously been as natural as breathing. The children were not sad or withdrawn. Indeed, they seemed remarkably peaceful and well-behaved. They simply appeared to have lost access to the particular form of expression that had made them recognizably childlike. Father Antonio received his first concerned visitor before the morning prayers had concluded. Signora Benedetti arrived at the church with questions that the elderly priest found difficult to answer. Her son was healthy, obedient, and apparently content, yet something indefinable had been taken from him during the night. She wanted to know whether the previous evening's entertainment might have involved practices that conflicted with Christian doctrine, and whether spiritual intervention might be required to restore her child's natural joy. The priest's own observations during the puppet show had left him with concerns that he had not yet fully articulated. While nothing in Giacomo's performance had been explicitly blasphemous or threatening, there had been qualities to the experience that suggested influences beyond the realm of conventional entertainment. The children's laughter had indeed been beautiful, but beauty itself could serve purposes that were not necessarily aligned with divine will. By midday, Father Antonio had received visits from more than a dozen families, all reporting the same phenomenon. Their children remained recognizably themselves in most respects, yet they had been somehow separated from their capacity for spontaneous joy. The parents' distress was compounded by their children's apparent lack of concern about this change. When asked directly whether they missed laughing, the children would consider the question seriously and then respond that they felt complete and satisfied as they were. The priest's investigation into Giacomo's current whereabouts revealed that the mysterious performer had established a temporary camp outside Venetia's walls, in a grove of olive trees that provided privacy while remaining close enough for easy access to the city. Several residents reported seeing him during the morning hours walking among the trees while carrying what appeared to be containers that caught and reflected sunlight in unusual ways. When Father Antonio approached Giacomo's campsite, he discovered an arrangement that was both simple and extraordinarily organized. A modest tent had been erected near the center of the grove, surrounded by the dismantled components of the puppet theater, arranged in precise geometric patterns. Most remarkably, suspended from the branches of the olive trees was a collection of small glass bottles, each no larger than a child's fist, that moved gently in the breeze while producing sounds that resembled distant wind chimes. Giacomo himself was seated on a wooden stool near his tent, apparently engaged in some form of delicate craftswork that required intense concentration. As Father Antonio approached, he could see that the stranger was manipulating tiny glass bottles with tools that seemed designed specifically for working with such miniature containers. The bottles themselves appeared to contain some form of liquid or gas that shifted color constantly, creating rainbow effects that were beautiful to observe, yet somehow unsettling in their endless motion. The priest's attempts to engage Giacomo in conversation about the children's condition met with the same polite silence that had characterized all previous interactions. However, when Father Antonio mentioned his concerns about the spiritual welfare of his parishioners, Giacomo's expression shifted in ways that suggested both understanding and something that might have been sympathy. He set aside his work and gestured for the priest to examine his collection of glass bottles more closely. Each bottle bore a small label written in script, so elegant that it resembled calligraphy more than functional writing. Father Antonio's knowledge of Latin allowed him to decipher some of the labels, though others were written in languages he could not identify. The bottles he could understand bore names that corresponded exactly to the children who had attended the previous evening's performance: Marco Benedetti, Sofia Romano, Giuseppe Mercanti, and dozens of others. The contents of each bottle seemed to be in constant, gentle motion, swirling and dancing in patterns that never quite repeated themselves. The colors within shifted through spectrums that included hues the priest had never seen before, as if normal light had been somehow concentrated and purified into forms that exceeded natural limitations. Most unnervingly, when Father Antonio listened carefully, he could detect sounds emanating from the bottles that resembled laughter, each bottle producing tones that seemed to match the vocal characteristics of the child whose name it bore. Giacomo's response to the priest's horrified realization was a series of gestures and expressions that conveyed complex meanings without requiring speech. He seemed to be explaining that the contents of the bottles were not stolen but preserved, not taken by force but given freely during moments of pure joy. His work, he suggested through elaborate pantomime, involved collecting experiences that would otherwise be lost to the passage of time, maintaining them in forms that would allow their essence to endure indefinitely. When Father Antonio demanded the immediate return of whatever had been taken from Venetia's children, Giacomo's response revealed the first signs of emotion he had displayed since his arrival. The priest's growing anger was met with patient explanation delivered entirely through movement and expression. Giacomo indicated that his actions had been motivated not by cruelty but by necessity. He too had once possessed the natural capacity for laughter, but circumstances beyond his control had separated him from this ability. His collection represented not theft but preservation, ensuring that the joy he could no longer experience himself would continue to exist in forms that could benefit others. Father Antonio's demand for more specific explanation led Giacomo to retrieve a particular bottle from his collection, one that bore no name label and contained substances that seemed darker and more chaotic than those in the other containers. When he held this bottle close to his chest, his entire demeanor changed, revealing depths of sorrow that transformed his appearance from mysterious to tragic. Through gestures of remarkable eloquence, he conveyed a story of loss that had occurred so long ago that the details had become mythic rather than historical. The unnamed bottle, he indicated, had once contained his own laughter, his own capacity for joy. It had been taken from him by someone whose motives and methods he could not adequately explain through pantomime alone. Since that loss, he had devoted his existence to collecting similar essences from others, not to deprive them of happiness, but to prevent the complete disappearance of joy from a world that seemed increasingly determined to destroy everything beautiful and innocent. Father Antonio's theological training provided no framework for evaluating claims that existed so far outside conventional religious doctrine. Yet the evidence before him, the bottles, their contents, the transformation of Venetia's children, suggested realities that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of human experience. Whether Giacomo's actions represented evil, madness, or something beyond normal moral categories remained unclear. The priest's final attempt at negotiation involved offering himself as a substitute for the children whose laughter had been preserved. If Giacomo's collection truly served some necessary purpose, perhaps an adult's willing sacrifice could provide what was needed, while allowing the children to recover their natural joy. This suggestion produced the most complex response Giacomo had yet delivered, involving expressions and gestures that seemed to cycle through gratitude, regret, and something resembling pity. Through elaborate pantomime, Giacomo conveyed that adult laughter, no matter how willing or sincere, lacked the essential qualities that made children's joy suitable for his purposes. The innocence, spontaneity, and purity that characterized childhood merriment could not be replicated by mature individuals whose experiences had been shaped by years of disappointment, compromise, and accumulated sorrow. His collection required specific ingredients that only certain sources could provide. As evening approached and Father Antonio prepared to return to Venetia with news that would bring little comfort to anxious parents, Giacomo made a gesture of remarkable generosity. Yet when Father Antonio attempted to accept the offering, he discovered that the bottle's substance could not be simply transferred or redistributed. The laughter it contained existed in a form that was no longer compatible with normal human physiology. The priest's return to Venetia that evening marked the beginning of a new phase in the city's relationship with Giacomo Ridere and his mysterious collection. As darkness settled over the city once again, the parents of Venetia faced choices that would define their response to circumstances that exceeded all previous experience. Some called for immediate action against the stranger who had altered their children, while others wondered whether such intervention might cause more harm than benefit. The children themselves remained curiously detached from these debates, content with their transformed state in ways that their parents found both reassuring and deeply troubling. The stage was set for confrontations that would test the limits of parental protection, religious authority, and community solidarity. Yet Giacomo continued his work in the olive grove, tending his collection with the dedication of someone preserving treasures of incalculable value, apparently unaware that forces were gathering that would soon challenge his right to continue his strange vocation. The second night after Giacomo Ridere's arrival in Venetia brought developments that would fundamentally alter the relationship between the mysterious performer and the city's increasingly concerned population. As twilight settled over the olive grove where the stranger had established his temporary residence, residents began to notice phenomena that extended far beyond the simple absence of children's laughter that had marked the previous day's discovery. The first unusual occurrence was reported by Giuseppe Mercanti, a wine merchant whose trade routes required him to travel the roads surrounding Venetia during the early evening hours. As he passed near the olive grove, he observed lights moving among the trees in patterns that seemed too organized to be natural yet too fluid to be produced by conventional lanterns or torches. The illumination appeared to pulse and dance, creating rhythms that reminded him uncomfortably of the musical laughter his own son had produced during Giacomo's puppet show. More disturbing still were the sounds that accompanied these lights. Giuseppe described hearing what he initially mistook for wind chimes, but as he listened more carefully, he realized the tones carried melodies that seemed familiar yet impossible to identify. The music, if it could be called music, created an atmosphere of profound nostalgia that made him want to abandon his wagon and walk into the grove to discover its source. Only his merchant's practical instincts and growing concern for his silent son prevented him from succumbing to this inexplicable urge. Word of Giuseppe's observations spread through Venetia's taverns and gathering places with the speed that only genuinely unsettling news can achieve. By the following morning, a steady stream of curious and increasingly worried residents had begun making excuses to travel the roads near Giacomo's camp, each hoping to glimpse whatever strange activities were occurring beneath the olive trees. What they discovered challenged their understanding of both the natural world and the stranger who had somehow acquired such complete influence over their children's capacity for joy. The olive grove itself had been transformed into something resembling an alchemist's laboratory, though the equipment and arrangements bore little resemblance to conventional scientific apparatus. Suspended from nearly every tree branch were glass bottles of varying sizes, each containing substances that moved with independent life. The bottles were connected by an intricate network of silver threads that caught sunlight and moonlight alike, creating a web of illumination that made the entire grove seem to glow from within. At the center of this elaborate installation, Giacomo had constructed what could only be described as a workshop dedicated entirely to the manipulation and refinement of captured laughter. Tables made from polished wood supported collections of specialized tools, delicate instruments that resembled a combination of jeweler's equipment and musical apparatus. Glass tubes, crystal lenses, and devices whose purposes could only be guessed at were arranged with the precision of someone who had spent years perfecting techniques that existed nowhere else in the known world. The bottles themselves revealed the true scope of Giacomo's activities since his arrival in Venetia. While Father Antonio had observed containers bearing the names of children who had attended the puppet show, the current collection included dozens of additional vessels labeled with names that corresponded to every child in the city. Most unnervingly, some bottles bore names of children from neighboring towns and villages, suggesting that Giacomo's influence extended far beyond the single performance that Venetia's residents had witnessed. Each bottle contained what appeared to be liquid light, substances that flowed and swirled in patterns that defied normal physics, while producing colors that exceeded the natural spectrum. The movements within each container were unique, creating individual displays that reflected the personality characteristics of the child whose laughter had been preserved. Some bottles contained gentle, golden spirals that moved with peaceful rhythm, while others held more energetic substances that danced and sparkled with irrepressible vitality. The sounds emanating from the collection were perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Giacomo's workshop. When wind moved through the grove, the bottles produced harmonies that were unmistakably composed of human laughter, yet the tones had been somehow purified and concentrated into forms that exceeded what any individual voice could produce. The resulting music was hauntingly beautiful, creating an atmosphere of joy so intense that listeners found themselves simultaneously uplifted and deeply disturbed by its artificial perfection. Marco Benedetti was among the first children to be drawn back to the grove by these mysterious sounds. Despite his parents' strict instructions to avoid the area where the strange performer had established his camp, the young boy found himself walking toward the olive trees with a sense of purpose that he could not explain or resist. His feet seemed to move independently of his conscious will, carrying him along paths that led inevitably toward the source of the musical laughter that called to him with increasing urgency. When Marco finally reached the edge of the grove, he discovered that he was not alone. Nearly a dozen other children had gathered among the trees, all standing in perfect silence while gazing at the collection of bottles that contained their stolen joy. Their expressions were neither sad nor angry, but rather showed a deep fascination that suggested they were observing something that belonged to them, yet had been transformed into forms they no longer recognized. Giacomo's response to this gathering of children revealed new dimensions of his relationship with the communities he visited. Rather than showing surprise or concern at their appearance, he greeted each child with gestures of recognition and what appeared to be genuine affection. His interactions with them resembled those of a craftsman, proudly displaying his finest work to the very people who had inspired its creation. Through elaborate pantomime, Giacomo began explaining the nature of his collection to his young audience. Each bottle, he indicated, contained not just laughter, but the essence of the moments that had produced that laughter, the pure joy, innocent wonder, and spontaneous delight that characterized childhood at its most perfect. These experiences, he suggested, were too precious to be lost to the inevitable processes of aging, disappointment, and the gradual corruption that adult life imposed on all human spirits. The children's responses to these explanations suggested understanding that exceeded their apparent ages. They nodded at appropriate moments, asked questions through gestures and expressions rather than words, and seemed to accept Giacomo's logic with a maturity that would have alarmed their parents had they been present to observe it. Most remarkably, several children began pointing to specific bottles and indicating through various signs that they recognized their own preserved laughter within the collection. What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of Giacomo's relationship with his young sources. Rather than keeping the children away from their transformed joy, he began a process of education that seemed designed to help them understand and appreciate what their laughter had become. He showed them how the bottles responded to various stimuli, how gentle tapping could change the patterns of movement within, how exposure to different types of light could alter the colors and intensities of the preserved substances. Most significantly, Giacomo demonstrated that the bottles could be made to produce specific melodies by arranging them in particular configurations. When properly organized, the collection became a kind of organ that could play symphonies of laughter, creating musical experiences that no conventional instrument could duplicate. The children watched these demonstrations with expressions of wonder that suggested they were witnessing magic of the highest order. Yet even as the children seemed to accept and even appreciate Giacomo's work, the adults of Venetia were reaching conclusions that would soon lead to direct confrontation. The steady stream of observers who had been monitoring the grove reported activities that seemed to confirm the worst fears about the stranger's intentions and capabilities. The man was not simply a performer who had somehow affected their children, but rather a practitioner of arts that existed outside all normal human experience. Father Antonio's second visit to the grove coincided with one of these children's gatherings, providing him with opportunities to observe interactions that strengthened his conviction that spiritual intervention was urgently required. The sight of Venetia's children standing among the olive trees in perfect silence while a mysterious stranger manipulated bottles containing their stolen laughter was more than his pastoral responsibilities could tolerate. The priest's attempts to call the children away from Giacomo's workshop met with polite but firm resistance. The children acknowledged his authority in all other matters, but regarding their relationship with the bottle collection and its creator, they seemed to have developed loyalties that superseded traditional obedience to religious guidance. When Father Antonio ordered them to return to their homes immediately, they smiled and nodded respectfully, then continued observing Giacomo's demonstrations with undiminished attention. This open defiance of clerical authority convinced Father Antonio that Giacomo's influence over the children had progressed beyond the realm of natural phenomena into territory that required the most serious forms of spiritual combat. He returned to Venetia with determination to organize responses that would match the unprecedented nature of the threat facing his parish. The priest's evening sermon in the cathedral addressed topics that no previous generation of Venetians had needed to consider. He spoke of supernatural influences that could separate souls from their natural capacities for joy, of strangers whose apparent kindness masked intentions that served purposes opposed to divine will. Most importantly, he warned his congregation that their children had become participants in processes that could threaten not just their temporal happiness, but their eternal spiritual welfare. The response to Father Antonio's warnings varied dramatically among different segments of Venetia's population. Parents whose children had attended the puppet show were predominantly supportive of immediate action to confront Giacomo and demand the return of whatever he had taken. However, a surprising number of residents expressed uncertainty about whether intervention was necessary or even advisable. Several factors contributed to this hesitation. The children themselves showed no signs of distress or unhappiness in their transformed state. Indeed, many parents privately admitted that their offspring had become more obedient, thoughtful, and mature since losing their capacity for spontaneous laughter. The absence of childish giggling and mischievous behavior had actually made household management considerably easier. Furthermore, some residents had begun to appreciate the musical qualities of the sounds emanating from the olive grove. The harmonies of preserved laughter created an atmosphere of serenity that seemed to enhance the natural beauty of the surrounding countryside. Several merchants reported that travelers were specifically seeking out Venetia after hearing rumors of the mysterious music that could be experienced near the city. This division within the community created opportunities for Giacomo to strengthen his position, while his critics organized their opposition. During the days following Father Antonio's sermon, additional children began appearing at the grove, drawn by curiosity about the bottles and the strange man who tended them with such obvious dedication. Each new visitor provided Giacomo with opportunities to expand his collection, while demonstrating the benevolent nature of his relationship with the young sources of his raw materials. The process by which new laughter was added to the collection proved to be far more subtle and sophisticated than the dramatic harvest that had occurred during the original puppet show. Giacomo had developed techniques that could extract joy from children through simple proximity and conversation, requiring no elaborate performances or theatrical presentations. A gentle touch, a meaningful glance, or even just extended exposure to the existing collection seemed sufficient to separate additional children from their natural capacity for spontaneous merriment. By the end of the week following his arrival, Giacomo's collection had grown to include samples from nearly every child in Venetia, along with several specimens obtained from young visitors who had traveled to the city specifically to investigate the rumors surrounding the mysterious performer. The grove had become a pilgrimage destination for children throughout the region, each drawn by impulses they could neither explain nor resist. The expansion of Giacomo's influence coincided with increasingly urgent appeals from Father Antonio for organized community action. The priest argued that every day of delay allowed the stranger to strengthen his hold over the children while reducing the likelihood that their natural joy could ever be restored. The situation had progressed beyond individual family concerns into a crisis that threatened the spiritual and cultural foundations of their entire community. Yet Giacomo himself seemed oblivious to the growing opposition his activities were generating. He continued his work with the same methodical dedication that had characterized his initial setup, apparently viewing his collection as a form of public service that any reasonable community would eventually learn to appreciate. His interactions with the children remained gentle and educational, while his attitude toward concerned adults reflected patient tolerance rather than hostility or defensiveness. The contrast between the children's acceptance and the adults' alarm created an atmosphere of tension that made normal community life increasingly difficult to maintain. Families found themselves divided between parents who wanted immediate action and children who showed no desire to be rescued from their transformed condition. Neighbors argued about whether Giacomo represented a threat or an opportunity, while merchants debated whether his presence was helping or harming their businesses. As the second week of Giacomo's residence in the olive grove drew to a close, it became clear that the situation could not continue indefinitely without some form of resolution. The children's silent contentment might satisfy their own needs, but the adults' growing anxiety was approaching levels that would soon demand decisive action regardless of the potential consequences. The stage was set for confrontations that would test not only the community's ability to protect its children, but also its willingness to challenge forces that existed outside the normal framework of human experience. Giacomo's collection continued to grow and evolve, creating music of increasing beauty and complexity, while the man himself remained a mystery that no amount of observation seemed capable of solving. The children of Venetia stood at the center of this developing crisis, transformed by experiences that had separated them from their former selves, yet connected them to something that might prove either wonderful or terrible, depending on perspectives that remained to be determined. Their silence spoke volumes about the power of the stranger who had entered their lives, while their contentment raised questions about the nature of happiness itself and whether parents had the right to determine what forms of joy their children should be allowed to experience. The olive grove glowed each evening with lights that seemed to pulse in rhythm with heartbeats, while the bottles sang lullabies composed entirely of children's laughter. Giacomo tended his collection with the devotion of someone preserving the most precious treasures in existence, apparently unaware that his garden of stolen joy was about to become a battlefield where the future of childhood itself would be decided. The third week of Giacomo Ridere's presence in Venetia brought revelations that would transform the community's understanding of both the mysterious performer and the true nature of the crisis that had engulfed their children. These discoveries began with the arrival of a most unexpected visitor, an elderly woman whose journey to the olive grove would provide the first comprehensive explanation of Giacomo's origins and the forces that had shaped his unusual vocation. Sister Margareta arrived in Venetia during the pre-dawn hours of a Tuesday morning, traveling alone despite her advanced age and the obvious difficulties such a journey presented for someone of her condition. The nun's appearance immediately attracted attention, not merely because solitary religious travelers were uncommon, but because her behavior suggested familiarity with circumstances that the residents of Venetia were only beginning to understand. Rather than seeking lodging at the cathedral or presenting herself to Father Antonio as protocol would normally require, Sister Margareta proceeded directly to the olive grove, where Giacomo maintained his collection. Her approach to the workshop was that of someone returning to a familiar location rather than discovering it for the first time. Most remarkably, the bottles suspended from the tree branches seemed to respond to her presence, their contents moving with increased activity while producing harmonies that welcomed her arrival. Giacomo's reaction to the nun's appearance revealed emotions that none of his previous interactions had displayed. For the first time since his arrival in Venetia, the silent performer showed signs of genuine distress, backing away from his workstation while making gestures that suggested both recognition and profound reluctance to engage with his unexpected visitor. His usual composed demeanor gave way to expressions of fear and what appeared to be shame, as if the nun's presence had awakened memories he preferred to keep buried. Sister Margareta's response to Giacomo's distress was neither harsh nor condemning, but rather carried the patient authority of someone accustomed to dealing with individuals whose circumstances had placed them beyond the reach of conventional help. She approached the collection of bottles with obvious appreciation for the craftsmanship and care that had gone into their creation, examining individual specimens while making soft sounds of recognition that suggested personal familiarity with many of the preserved essences. The conversation that followed between the nun and the laughter collector was conducted entirely through gestures, expressions, and the manipulation of the bottles themselves. To observers, it appeared that the two were using the collection as a form of language, arranging and rearranging containers to create patterns that conveyed complex meanings. The substance within each bottle responded to these configurations, producing lights and sounds that seemed to translate emotions and memories into forms that could be shared and understood. Through this unique form of communication, Sister Margareta began to reveal the story that explained both Giacomo's condition and his compulsive need to collect the joy of others. The tale she told through bottle arrangements and symbolic gestures was one of tragedy that had begun decades earlier in circumstances that bore remarkable similarities to those currently unfolding in Venetia. Giacomo had once been a child himself, living in a small monastery town, where he had served as an apprentice to a master toy maker, whose creations brought delight to children throughout the region. The boy's own laughter had been particularly magical, possessing qualities that seemed to enhance the happiness of everyone who heard it. His joy was so pure and infectious that even the most serious adults found themselves smiling in his presence, while other children were drawn to him as if he possessed some form of natural magnetism. This exceptional capacity for happiness had attracted the attention of someone whose interest in children's joy served purposes far darker than preservation or protection. The individual in question, Sister Margareta's arrangements suggested a woman of noble birth whose beauty masked intentions of supernatural malevolence had arrived in the monastery town during a time of celebration, presenting herself as a patron of the arts who wished to commission special toys for her own household. The woman's true nature had been concealed behind elaborate deceptions that fooled even the monastery's most experienced spiritual authorities. Her interactions with the local children appeared generous and benevolent, involving gifts, entertainment, and promises of opportunities that seemed too good to refuse. Yet beneath these pleasant surfaces lay a hunger for innocence that could only be satisfied through the complete consumption of everything that made childhood precious and magical. The process by which Giacomo had lost his own capacity for laughter involved rituals that Sister Margareta could only hint at through her bottle arrangements. The woman had not simply taken the boy's joy, but had somehow inverted it, transforming his natural happiness into a compulsive need to seek and preserve the laughter of others. The curse she had placed upon him was both punishment and tool, ensuring that he would spend the remainder of his existence serving her purposes while believing he was following his own desires. The cruel sophistication of this transformation lay in its psychological completeness. Giacomo genuinely believed that his collection served beneficial purposes, preserving precious essences that would otherwise be lost to the inevitable corruptions of adult life. He experienced authentic satisfaction from his work and felt genuine affection for the children who provided his raw materials. Yet these positive emotions were themselves products of the supernatural manipulation that had reshaped his fundamental nature. Sister Margareta's revelation of these facts created a crisis of understanding that challenged every assumption the Venetians had made about their situation. Yet the nun's story also carried warnings that made immediate action more urgent rather than less necessary. The woman who had originally cursed Giacomo continued to exist somewhere in the world, sustained by the joy that her unwilling servant collected and preserved for her consumption. Each bottle in his collection represented not just a child's stolen laughter, but sustenance for a creature whose appetite for innocence could never be permanently satisfied. The revelation of this larger context transformed the gathering crisis from a local problem into something that threatened children far beyond Venetia's boundaries. Giacomo's collection was not an end in itself, but rather a means of feeding something whose existence posed ongoing danger to every community that contained young people. The bottles were beautiful and seemingly harmless, but they served as conduits through which pure innocence was gradually transferred to a being whose very survival depended on the destruction of childhood joy. Sister Margareta's presence in the grove attracted the same children who had been drawn to observe Giacomo's previous activities. However, their responses to the nun were markedly different from their interactions with the laughter collector. The children's behavior in the nun's presence revealed aspects of their transformation that had not been apparent during their earlier visits to the grove. This development alarmed both Sister Margareta and Giacomo himself, suggesting that the children's transformation was progressing beyond simple loss of laughter into something that threatened their fundamental humanity. The bottles that contained their joy were apparently establishing connections that allowed external influences to affect their behavior in ways that neither had anticipated or intended. Among the children gathered in the grove that evening was Sofia Romano, the 8-year-old daughter of Venetia's most prosperous silk merchant. Sophia had been notable throughout her childhood for laughter that seemed to contain entire symphonies of happiness, musical qualities that had made her the center of attention at every social gathering her family attended. Her presence in Giacomo's collection was represented by one of the most beautiful bottles, containing substances that moved with particular grace while producing tones of exceptional purity. Sophia's behavior during this gathering differed significantly from that of the other children. While they moved with the coordination that suggested shared influence, she maintained clear signs of individual awareness and decision-making capability. Her attention focused not on the bottle collection or on Giacomo's activities, but rather on Sister Margareta herself, studying the nun with intensity that suggested recognition of something important but difficult to define. The girl's scrutiny of Sister Margareta revealed intelligence that had been enhanced rather than diminished by her transformation. Sophia seemed to understand aspects of the situation that remained hidden from the other children, and her expression suggested she was evaluating options and possibilities that extended beyond simple acceptance of her current condition. Most remarkably, she began making subtle gestures that appeared to be attempts at communication with the nun, independent of the collective behavior displayed by her companions. Sister Margareta's response to Sophia's attention was immediate and profound. The nun recognized in the child something that represented hope for breaking the cycle that had trapped Giacomo and threatened to ensnare an entire generation of Venetian children. Sophia's preserved laughter, rather than being simply consumed by the malevolent force that sustained itself through such collections, had apparently retained connections to its original source that might allow for restoration or redirection. The possibility that Sophia's transformation could be reversed created opportunities that neither Giacomo nor Sister Margareta had previously considered. If one child could be restored to natural joy, the process might provide insights that could help others, while simultaneously weakening the supernatural forces that perpetuated the entire system of collection and consumption. Yet attempting such a restoration would require risks that extended far beyond Venetia's boundaries. The woman who had originally cursed Giacomo would undoubtedly become aware of any serious threats to her sustenance, and her responses to such challenges had historically involved escalations that brought suffering to entire communities. Sister Margareta's own presence in the grove had probably already attracted unwanted attention from forces that preferred to operate in secrecy and shadow. The nun's decision to remain in Venetia despite these risks demonstrated a commitment to protecting innocence that transcended personal safety considerations. Her years of studying the supernatural predation that targeted children had convinced her that passive responses only encouraged further aggression from entities whose appetites grew stronger through feeding. Sometimes the only effective protection required confronting such forces directly, regardless of the potential consequences for those brave enough to offer resistance. As night fell over the olive grove, the three central figures in the developing drama, Giacomo, Sister Margareta, and Sophia, found themselves engaged in a complex negotiation that would determine not only the fate of Venetia's children, but also the future of Giacomo's long servitude to forces he had never chosen to serve. The bottle collection sang its harmonies of preserved laughter while the participants struggled with decisions that would reshape the fundamental balance between innocence and the hunger that sought to consume it. The children gathered around them in perfect silence, their transformed state making them witnesses to events whose significance they could sense, but not fully comprehend. Their presence served as both motivation and reminder of what was at stake in the supernatural contest that was about to unfold. Each bottle in Giacomo's collection represented a life that had been altered, and each decision made during the coming confrontation would help determine whether those alterations could ever be reversed. Giacomo himself stood at the center of contradictions that had defined his existence for decades. His genuine love for children warred with compulsions that forced him to harm them, while his artistic appreciation for beauty conflicted with his role in feeding something whose very existence negated everything beautiful and pure. The arrival of Sister Margareta and Sophia's unique response to the situation had created possibilities for redemption that he had never dared to imagine. Yet pursuing those possibilities would require betraying the only purpose his cursed existence had ever known. The grove filled with tension that seemed to make the very air vibrate with potential energy. The bottles responded to this atmosphere by producing more complex harmonies than ever before, as if the preserved laughter within them was trying to communicate something urgent about the choices being made on their behalf. The sounds created by their synchronized resonance were so beautiful that passing travelers stopped on the distant roads to listen, unaware that they were hearing the voices of children whose joy had been transformed into something that no longer belonged entirely to the human world. Sister Margareta began preparations for what she privately believed would be her final attempt to break a cycle of predation that had continued far too long. Her decision to gamble everything on Sophia's potential for restoration was based on insights gathered through decades of studying supernatural threats, but even her extensive experience provided no guarantees that intervention would succeed, rather than simply creating new forms of suffering for everyone involved. The night deepened around them as forces began to gather that would test the limits of faith, courage, and the power of innocence to resist corruption. The Laughter Harvester's Garden of Stolen Joy had become the focal point for a conflict that would determine whether children's happiness could ever again be considered safe from those whose hunger for innocence knew no bounds. In the distance, unnoticed by anyone in the grove, shadows began moving with purpose that suggested the arrival of entities whose interest in the night's activities extended far beyond mere observation. The woman who had cursed Giacomo decades earlier had finally become aware that her carefully constructed system of collection and consumption was facing challenges that threatened her very existence. Her response to this threat would transform Venetia from a peaceful trading city into a battlefield where the future of childhood itself would be decided. The stage was set for confrontations that would test every assumption about the nature of good and evil, the power of curses and the possibility of redemption, and the question of whether love could triumph over supernatural forces that had fed on innocence for centuries without meaningful opposition. The children of Venetia waited in their transformed silence, unaware that their fate was about to be decided by events that would echo through legends for generations to come. The fourth week of Giacomo Ridere's residence in the olive grove brought events that would forever alter the delicate balance between the supernatural forces at work in Venetia and the human community that had become their unwitting battlefield. The catalyst for these developments was an occurrence that no one, not Sister Margareta with her extensive knowledge of mystical predation, not Father Antonio with his theological training, and certainly not the parents of Venetia, with their desperate concern for their transformed children, had anticipated or prepared to address. Sophia Romano's unique resistance to the collective influence affecting the other children had not gone unnoticed by the malevolent force that sustained itself through Giacomo's collections. The entity that had cursed the Laughter Harvester decades earlier possessed awareness that extended far beyond physical presence, monitoring her network of collectors and their accumulated treasures with the vigilance of someone whose very existence depended on maintaining control over every aspect of the operation. Sophia's retention of individual consciousness while her peers drifted into synchronized compliance represented a threat that demanded immediate attention. The girl's preserved laughter, rather than flowing smoothly toward its intended destination, had begun to exhibit properties that suggested potential for rebellion against the supernatural architecture that was designed to make resistance impossible. Left unchecked, Sophia's example might inspire similar developments in other children, potentially undermining years of careful cultivation and preparation. The entity's response to this threat manifested through Giacomo himself, though the compulsions that drove his actions operated below the level of his conscious awareness. As dawn broke over the olive grove on what would become known as the Day of Weeping, the Laughter Harvester found himself preparing for a ceremony that felt both inevitable and completely wrong. His hands moved with practiced precision while arranging specialized equipment, yet his mind filled with growing horror at what those preparations were intended to accomplish. The ceremony that Giacomo felt compelled to organize was unlike anything he had previously conducted. Rather than the gentle harvesting of laughter through entertainment and joy, this ritual was designed to extract the very essence of childhood innocence through methods that would fundamentally alter Sophia's nature. The process would not simply collect her laughter, but would consume every aspect of what made her recognizably human, leaving behind only a vessel that could serve the entity's purposes without the complications introduced by independent thought or resistance. Sister Margaretta's recognition of what was being prepared sent her into action with urgency that reflected both her understanding of the supernatural forces at work and her determination to prevent another innocent soul from being completely destroyed by powers that had already claimed too many victims. The nun's decades of study had taught her that certain mystical processes, once begun, could not be interrupted without catastrophic consequences for everyone involved. Yet the alternative, allowing Sophia to be consumed, was unthinkable. The nun's first action was to attempt direct communication with the children who had gathered in the grove for what their transformed instincts told them would be a significant event. Sister Margareta hoped that some remnant of their original personalities might respond to appeals for collective resistance against forces that threatened one of their companions. However, her efforts revealed the extent to which the children's transformation had progressed beyond simple loss of laughter into something approaching complete spiritual subjugation. The children's responses to Sister Margareta's appeals were polite, but fundamentally empty, acknowledging her words while demonstrating no real comprehension of their meaning. Their attention remained focused on Giacomo's preparations with the intensity of individuals whose only purpose was to witness and validate whatever ritual was about to unfold. Most disturbing of all, several children began to arrange themselves in patterns that would facilitate the ceremony, moving with coordination that suggested external guidance rather than independent decision-making. Sophia herself seemed aware of the danger she faced, yet her ability to respond was limited by the very transformation that had made her a target for escalated attention. While she retained more individual consciousness than her peers, the connection between her preserved laughter and her current existence meant that any attempt to flee or resist might result in consequences even worse than submission to the planned ceremony. Her preserved essence had become both her greatest strength and her most vulnerable weakness. Father Antonio's arrival at the grove during these crucial hours brought additional complexity to an already dangerous situation. The priest had come in response to reports from concerned parishioners who had observed unusual activity in the area, but his presence triggered responses from Giacomo that revealed new aspects of the cursed performer's condition. When confronted with religious authority, the laughter harvester began displaying signs of internal conflict that threatened to tear apart the supernatural compulsions that controlled his behavior. The priest's attempts to bless the grove and consecrate the area against evil influences created a spiritual battlefield where competing forces struggled for dominance over the ceremony's outcome. Giacomo found himself caught between the compulsions that demanded he complete the ritual and new influences that offered the possibility of resistance against his supernatural bondage. The resulting internal warfare manifested in physical symptoms that made him appear to be suffering from some form of violent illness. Yet even as Giacomo struggled against the forces that had controlled him for decades, the ceremony continued to advance toward its inevitable conclusion. The specialized equipment arranged itself according to patterns that existed in his muscle memory rather than his conscious knowledge, while the children took positions that would allow them to serve as witnesses and validators for what was about to occur. Sophia stood at the center of these preparations, her preserved laughter calling to her from its bottle with increasing urgency. The moment when Sophia's essence began to flow from the bottle toward the ceremonial apparatus marked the point at which the supernatural architecture surrounding Giacomo's activities became visible to normal human perception. The air in the grove filled with phenomena that challenged the observer's understanding of physical reality, lights that cast shadows upward, sounds that seemed to originate from multiple directions simultaneously, and presences that could be sensed but not directly observed. Sister Margareta's intervention during this critical phase required her to draw upon knowledge and abilities that she had hoped never to use again. The nun's background included training in spiritual combat techniques that were considered dangerous even by ecclesiastical authorities, methods that could protect innocence but only at tremendous personal cost to those who employed them. Her decision to engage these forces directly was motivated by the recognition that Sophia's consumption would strengthen the malevolent entity beyond any previous level, potentially making future resistance impossible. The spiritual battle that erupted in the olive grove transformed the space into something resembling a battlefield, where the weapons were faith, will, and the accumulated power of preserved innocence. Sister Margareta's efforts to disrupt the ceremony created opportunities for Giacomo to break free from his supernatural bondage, but only if he could find the strength to choose resistance over the compulsions that had defined his existence for so long. The children's role in this conflict was perhaps the most tragic aspect of the entire situation. Their transformed state made them naturally inclined to support the completion of the ceremony, yet their essential humanity created internal contradictions that manifested as visible distress. They wanted to help Sophia, but lacked the capacity to understand what help would actually involve. Their preserved laughter called to them from the bottle collection, creating a cacophony of voices that seemed to plead for salvation while lacking the power to save themselves. Father Antonio's prayers and blessings provided crucial support for Sister Margaretta's more direct intervention, but the priest's conventional religious training had not prepared him for the realities of supernatural combat. His faith was strong and his intentions pure, yet the forces arrayed against them operated according to rules that transcended normal theological understanding. The battle required not just spiritual strength, but practical knowledge of how to combat entities whose power derived from the systematic corruption of innocence. The turning point in the conflict came when Giacomo, supported by the combined spiritual efforts of his allies, managed to break free from the compulsions that had controlled his actions for decades. This liberation, however, came at a cost that immediately became apparent to everyone present. Without the supernatural forces that had sustained him, Giacomo began aging rapidly, as if decades of accumulated time were demanding payment for the years they had been held in suspension. Yet even as his physical form deteriorated, Giacomo's newfound freedom allowed him to attempt something that might save Sophia, while providing a measure of redemption for his years of unwilling service to evil. Using knowledge gained through decades of collecting and preserving laughter, he began a counter-ritual designed to restore the preserved essences to their original owners, rather than allowing them to flow toward the malevolent entity that had been their intended destination. The process of restoration proved far more complex than simple reversal of the original harvesting. The children's laughter had been transformed during its time in the bottles, taking on qualities that made it incompatible with normal human physiology. Returning these enhanced essences to their sources required careful modification and preparation that pushed Giacomo's expertise to its absolute limits, while his physical condition continued to deteriorate. Sophia's case presented particular challenges because her laughter had been partially consumed by the interrupted ceremony. The portion that remained in her bottle was no longer complete, while the part that had been drawn toward the ritual apparatus existed in a state of suspension that made it extremely vulnerable to recapture by hostile forces. Rescuing her essence required speed and precision that seemed impossible given the circumstances. Sister Margaretta's assistance during this phase was crucial, as her knowledge of spiritual protection allowed her to shield the restoration process from interference by the malevolent entity that had become aware of the threat to its accumulated treasures. The nuns' efforts created a temporary sanctuary within the grove that prevented external forces from disrupting Giacomo's delicate work, but maintaining these protections required constant vigilance and steadily depleted her own spiritual reserves. The children themselves began to change as the restoration process progressed, though not in ways that anyone had anticipated. Rather than simply returning to their original states, they seemed to be awakening to awareness of what had been done to them and what was being attempted on their behalf. Their synchronized compliance gave way to individual responses that reflected both hope and terror as they realized the true nature of their situation. Some children began to remember fragments of experiences that had occurred while they were under supernatural influence, recollections that revealed the extent to which they had been used as unwilling participants in activities that served the entity's purposes. These memories created trauma that would require careful attention and healing, but they also provided crucial insights into the broader network of collection and consumption that extended far beyond Venetia's boundaries. As the restoration process neared completion, the malevolent entity's attempts to regain control of the situation became increasingly desperate and direct. The grove filled with manifestations of supernatural rage that threatened to overwhelm the protections Sister Margareta had established. Shadows moved with independent malice, temperatures fluctuated wildly, and the very air seemed to thicken with hostility that made breathing difficult. Yet Giacomo persevered in his efforts to complete the restoration. driven by determination to achieve something meaningful with the freedom he had gained at such tremendous cost. His physical form continued to deteriorate as decades of suspended aging demanded their due, but his spirit seemed to grow stronger as he approached the completion of work that would serve love rather than predation. The moment when Sophia's laughter was successfully restored to her created a cascade of joy that swept through the grove like a cleansing wind. Her voice, when it emerged after weeks of silence, carried not just her original happiness, but enhanced qualities that reflected the transformations her essence had undergone during its preservation. Her laugh was both familiar and new, recognizably hers yet enriched by experiences that had deepened rather than diminished its power to bring joy to others. The success of Sophia's restoration provided the template for returning the other children's preserved laughter, though each case required individual attention and modification. The process took hours to complete, during which the grove was transformed from a site of supernatural predation into something resembling a sanctuary where innocence could be protected and celebrated rather than consumed. As dawn broke over Venetia on what the residents would later remember as the Day of Return, the children's voices could once again be heard throughout the city. Their laughter carried new qualities that reflected the experiences they had undergone, creating music that was less innocent and wise, joyful and profound. The sound attracted every resident to their windows and doorways, as parents and community members experienced relief so intense it brought many to tears. Yet the victory achieved in the olive grove came with costs that would be felt for generations to come. Giacomo's sacrifice had saved the children and dealt a significant blow to the entity that had preyed upon innocence for centuries. But the battle had also revealed the existence of threats that extended far beyond any single community's ability to address. The network of supernatural predation that targeted children operated on a scale that made Venetia's experience only one small part of a much larger and more dangerous pattern. Sister Margareta's warnings about the entity's likely responses to this defeat created urgency around the need for ongoing vigilance and protection. The creature that had sustained itself through collected innocence would not accept the loss of its Venetian treasures without attempting revenge, and its future activities might target not just children, but entire communities that had shown capability for resistance. The grove itself had been permanently changed by the supernatural forces that had operated within its boundaries. While the immediate threats had been neutralized, the area retained properties that made it both sacred and dangerous, a place where the boundaries between normal reality and mystical forces remained thinner than anywhere else in the region. The bottles that had once contained stolen laughter now stood empty but somehow expectant, as if waiting for new purposes that had not yet been revealed. As the fourth chapter of this extraordinary tale drew to its close, the residents of Venetia faced a future that would be forever shaped by their encounter with forces that existed beyond the normal boundaries of human experience. Their children had been restored, but the innocence they had lost could never be completely recovered. The knowledge of what had occurred would influence every aspect of their lives, creating both wisdom and burden that would be passed down through generations. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would determine not just the immediate fate of everyone involved, but the future relationship between the forces of innocence and the entities that sought to consume them. The battle for Venetia's children had been won, but the war for the safety of childhood itself was far from over. The restoration of Venetia's children brought 3 days of celebration that would be remembered for generations as the Festival of Returned Joy. Yet beneath the surface of this communal relief, those who had participated in the supernatural battle understood that their victory had been only the opening movement in a conflict that would determine the future of innocence itself. The malevolent entity that had lost its Venetian collection would not accept such defeat without response, and when that retaliation came, it would test every lesson learned during the struggle to save the children's laughter. The first signs of impending danger appeared on the morning of the fourth day, when residents throughout Venetia began reporting dreams that shared disturbing similarities despite occurring to individuals who had no contact with each other. These visions featured a woman of extraordinary beauty, whose presence brought feelings of dread that lingered long after awakening. She moved through landscapes that resembled Venetia but transformed into something hostile and wrong, searching for something that had been taken from her with evident determination to reclaim her lost property. Sister Margareta recognized the significance of these shared dreams immediately. The entity that had controlled Giacomo for decades was preparing to manifest directly in Venetia, abandoning the subtle methods that had characterized her previous operations in favor of confrontation that would settle the question of ownership over the children's restored joy once and for all. Such direct intervention carried enormous risks for the entity, but it also promised rewards that would more than compensate for the dangers involved. The nuns' urgent consultations with Father Antonio revealed the full scope of the threat they were facing. The entity's physical manifestation would transform her from a spiritual influence into something that could affect the material world directly, making her capable of actions that no amount of prayer or conventional protection could prevent. The battle for Venetia's children was about to become a war for the soul of the entire community. Giacomo's condition during these critical days reflected the internal transformations he had undergone during his liberation from supernatural bondage. His physical deterioration had stabilized, though he remained visibly aged by the decades that had caught up with him all at once. More significantly, his restored humanity brought with it memories of his original childhood and the person he had been before his encounter with the entity that had reshaped his existence. These recollections provided crucial insights into the nature of their opponent, while also creating profound grief for the life that had been stolen from him. The laughter harvester's newfound clarity about his situation revealed details about the entity that no amount of theological study or mystical research could have uncovered. She was not simply a creature that fed on innocence, but rather someone who had once been human herself before choosing transformation into something that existed primarily through the consumption of joy. Her beauty was not natural but crafted, maintained through centuries of feeding on the happiness of children whose laughter sustained both her physical form and her supernatural abilities. Most critically, Giacomo's memories revealed that the entity's power was not unlimited, but rather dependent on maintaining a continuous supply of collected innocence. The loss of her Venetian treasures had created a deficit that threatened her very existence, making desperate action inevitable rather than simply likely. She would come to Venetia not just to reclaim what had been taken, but to harvest enough additional joy to compensate for the energy she would expend in direct manifestation. The children themselves had been profoundly changed by their experiences of loss and restoration. While their laughter had been returned to them, it now carried qualities that reflected the transformations their essence had undergone during preservation. Their joy was deeper and more musical than before, creating harmonies when they played together that attracted attention from throughout the region. Yet this enhanced quality also made them more valuable as potential sources for supernatural collection, increasing rather than decreasing the danger they faced. Sofia Romano had emerged from the ordeal with capabilities that none of the adults fully understood but all recognized as significant. Her preserved laughter had been enhanced rather than simply restored, giving her the ability to perceive spiritual influences that remained hidden from normal human awareness. She could sense the approaching manifestation days before it would become apparent to others, and her descriptions of what she observed provided crucial intelligence for planning defensive measures. The girl's enhanced perception revealed that the entity was not approaching Venetia alone. The supernatural predator had gathered other victims of her centuries-long feeding, individuals who had been transformed into servants whose existence depended entirely on their mistress's continued survival. These beings retained human appearance but no longer possessed human limitations, making them capable of actions that would challenge every assumption about what mortal defenders could accomplish. Father Antonio's response to these revelations involved reaching out to religious authorities throughout the region, seeking assistance from individuals whose training and experience might provide resources for confronting supernatural threats of this magnitude. However, his efforts revealed the extent to which such knowledge had been suppressed or lost during centuries when church doctrine emphasized spiritual rather than practical approaches to mystical dangers. Most of the contacts he reached either dismissed his reports as fantasies or admitted their own ignorance about methods for combating entities like the one threatening Venetia. The priest's frustration with official channels led him to seek help from sources that existed outside conventional religious hierarchies. Sister Margaretta's network of contacts included individuals whose study of supernatural predation had taken them beyond the boundaries of orthodox theology into territories that were both dangerous and necessary. These practitioners possessed knowledge that could make the difference between salvation and destruction, but accessing their assistance required accepting approaches that challenged fundamental assumptions about proper spiritual conduct. As the entity's manifestation drew closer, the atmosphere in Venetia began to change in ways that affected every resident, regardless of their involvement in previous events. The air itself seemed to thicken with malevolent presence, while temperatures fluctuated unpredictably despite stable weather conditions. Animals throughout the region exhibited signs of distress, with livestock refusing to graze and pets hiding in places where they had never sought shelter before. Most unnervingly, the enhanced laughter of Venetia's children began to attract responses that suggested the entity was already influencing events within the city. Other children from neighboring communities started arriving in Venetia with explanations that made little sense to their accompanying adults. These young visitors claimed to have heard music that called to them from an impossible distance, melodies that promised wonderful experiences if they could only reach the source of such beautiful sounds. The influx of additional children created both opportunities and dangers for the community's defenders. Each new arrival represented another potential victim for the entity's feeding, yet their presence also provided a larger population base for collective resistance if proper coordination could be achieved. Sister Margareta recognized that the entity's strategy involved using Venetia's enhanced children as bait to attract additional sources of innocence, creating a situation where successful defense would require protecting not just local residents but visitors whose parents had no understanding of the supernatural forces at work. Giacomo's role in the coming confrontation was complicated by his unique position as someone who understood both sides of the conflict. His decades of service to the entity had provided him with insights into her methods and weaknesses, but his recent liberation had also left him vulnerable to recapture if he was exposed to her direct influence. The question of whether he could contribute to Venetia's defense without being turned back into a weapon against the community remained unanswered. The resolution of this dilemma came through Sophia's enhanced perception, which revealed that Giacomo's transformation during his liberation had created protections that his former mistress could not easily overcome. His restored humanity included spiritual defenses that made him immune to the compulsions that had once controlled him, though these protections came at the cost of making him extremely vulnerable to direct physical attack. He could resist supernatural influence, but not supernatural violence. The strategic planning that emerged from these realizations centered on creating a defense that would protect Venetia's children while simultaneously drawing the entity into a confrontation that would expose her to vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The approach required turning the community itself into a trap, using the enhanced laughter of the restored children as bait while preparing countermeasures that would activate once the entity committed herself to direct action. Sister Margareta's preparations for this confrontation involved rituals and protections that drew upon knowledge accumulated through years of studying supernatural predation. The nun had devoted her life to understanding entities like the one threatening Venetia, and her research had revealed methods for creating sanctified spaces that could serve as refuges where innocence could be protected even against direct mystical assault. However, implementing these protections required sacrifices that would fundamentally change the nature of the community they were designed to preserve. The process of sanctification involved transforming Venetia's central piazza into something resembling a fortress built from faith rather than stone. The area was marked with symbols and blessed with rituals that created boundaries capable of excluding supernatural influences while allowing human residents to enter and leave freely. Yet maintaining these protections required constant spiritual energy, demanding levels of prayer and devotion that would reshape the daily lives of everyone involved. Father Antonio's role in these preparations involved coordinating the spiritual efforts of the entire community, organizing prayer schedules and ritual observances that would provide the energy necessary to maintain the sanctified defenses. The priest discovered that protecting innocence required not just individual faith, but collective commitment to principles that transcended personal comfort and convenience. The entire population would need to participate in maintaining defenses that demanded unprecedented unity of purpose. The children's contribution to these preparations involved learning to use their enhanced laughter as both weapon and shield against the approaching threat. Sophia's insights into the nature of their transformed joy revealed that it possessed qualities that could repel supernatural predation while strengthening the spiritual defenses being constructed around them. However, using their laughter in this way required coordination and discipline that challenged every assumption about how children should behave in dangerous situations. The entity's manifestation began during the pre-dawn hours of a day that would become known throughout the region as the Night of Final Laughter. Her arrival was heralded by phenomena that made her presence impossible to ignore or deny, shadows that moved independently of their sources, sounds that seemed to emerge from the earth itself, and an aura of wrongness that made every living thing in Venetia recoil in instinctive terror. Yet the entity's physical form, when it finally became visible, was breathtakingly beautiful rather than obviously monstrous. She appeared as a woman in her prime, possessed of features so perfect they seemed to have been crafted rather than born. Her clothing shifted constantly between different styles and periods, as if she existed in multiple times simultaneously, while her eyes held depths that suggested experiences spanning centuries of existence. The entity's first actions upon manifestation involved attempting to reclaim the children whose laughter had been restored, expecting to find them vulnerable to influence that had previously proven irresistible. However, her efforts revealed that the restoration process had created unexpected obstacles to her predation. The enhanced quality of their joy made it more difficult rather than easier to separate from its sources, while the spiritual protections surrounding the community created barriers that challenged even her considerable abilities. The entity's frustration at these obstacles manifested in displays of power that demonstrated why direct confrontation with such forces was normally considered impossible. She could manipulate reality itself within limited ranges, creating effects that challenged every assumption about the boundaries between possible and impossible. Streets rearranged themselves to confuse defenders, buildings shifted position to create new attack routes, and the very air became hostile to human breathing. Yet Venetia's defenders had prepared for exactly these kinds of assault. The sanctified piazza remained stable despite the chaos surrounding it, providing a refuge where children could be protected while adults organized resistance. The community's unified spiritual efforts created a foundation of faith that proved capable of withstanding even direct supernatural attack, though maintaining these defenses required constant effort from every participant. The battle's turning point came when Sophia and the other enhanced children discovered that their transformed laughter could not only resist the entity's influence, but could actually cause her pain. The joy they produced had been enriched rather than diminished by their experiences, creating a purity that was toxic to beings whose existence depended on the corruption of innocence. Their coordinated laughter became a weapon more powerful than any conventional force. The entity's response to this unexpected resistance revealed both her desperation and her remaining strength. Unable to simply collect the children's joy as planned, she began attempting to destroy what she could not possess, reasoning that eliminating sources of enhanced innocence would at least prevent them from being used against her in the future. This shift from collection to destruction marked the beginning of the final phase of the confrontation. Giacomo's intervention during this critical moment required him to make choices that would define the remainder of his existence. His knowledge of the entity's methods allowed him to predict her tactics and provide warnings that saved lives, but protecting the children required him to expose himself to dangers that his deteriorated condition made potentially fatal. His decision to prioritize their safety over his own survival represented the completion of his transformation from unwilling servant to willing protector. The former laughter harvester's final contribution to the battle involved using his intimate knowledge of preservation techniques to create a trap that would contain the entity's essence rather than simply defeating her physical manifestation. Drawing upon decades of experience with collecting and storing supernatural energy, he began a ritual that would imprison her in much the same way that children's laughter had once been bottled for her consumption. Yet this reversal of roles required Giacomo to sacrifice his own spiritual essence as the container for the entity's imprisonment. His restored humanity provided the purity necessary to create bonds that could hold something as fundamentally corrupt as his former mistress, but using himself as a prison meant accepting an existence that would be worse than death. He would live on, but forever bound to the creature whose evil he was containing. Sister Margaretta's recognition of what Giacomo was attempting led her to support his efforts while seeking alternatives that might achieve the same result without requiring such complete self-sacrifice. The nun's research had revealed theoretical methods for creating external containers that could serve the same purpose, but implementing these alternatives would require time and resources that the current crisis did not allow. The climax of the confrontation came when the entity, recognizing that escape was impossible, attempted to destroy everything rather than accept imprisonment. Her final assault on the community's defenses required every available resource to resist, pushing the defenders beyond their apparent limits, while the fate of innocence itself hung in the balance. Yet the children's enhanced laughter proved equal to even this ultimate challenge. Their coordinated joy created a barrier of pure innocence that the entity could not penetrate or destroy, while their music provided spiritual energy that strengthened every other aspect of the community's defenses. Giacomo's successful completion of the imprisonment ritual marked the end of the entity's threat to Venetia and any other community that might have fallen victim to her predation. Yet his sacrifice in achieving this victory created grief that tempered the celebration of their triumph. The man who had been transformed from unwilling servant to willing protector had given everything to ensure that no other children would suffer the fate that had been intended for him so many decades earlier. The aftermath of the battle revealed transformations that would reshape Venetia permanently. The community's experience of unified spiritual defense had created bonds among residents that transcended normal social boundaries, while their successful resistance to supernatural predation had established them as a refuge where innocence could be protected. Sophia's enhanced abilities had stabilized into gifts that would serve the community for the remainder of her life. Her capacity to perceive spiritual influences made her an early warning system against future threats, while her understanding of the nature of joy allowed her to help other children develop their own defenses against predation. Sister Margaretta's role evolved from protector to teacher as she established a school dedicated to training others in the recognition and resistance of mystical threats to children. Her knowledge, accumulated through decades of study and refined through direct experience, became the foundation for a new approach to spiritual defense that combined religious faith with practical understanding of supernatural dangers. The entity's imprisonment in Giacomo's sacrifice created a permanent reminder of both the reality of evil and the possibility of redemption. The former laughter harvester's spirit continued to exist, forever bound to the creature he had chosen to contain, but his ongoing presence provided reassurance that the most dangerous predator of innocence had been neutralized permanently. As the years passed and the immediate crisis faded into memory, the children of Venetia grew into adults whose laughter retained the enhanced qualities that had saved their community. Their joy became a gift they passed on to their own children, creating generations who possessed natural defenses against predation while maintaining the capacity for happiness that made life worth protecting. The legend of the laughter harvester spread throughout the region and beyond, serving as both warning and inspiration to communities that faced their own encounters with forces that sought to corrupt innocence. The story reminded parents and children alike that joy was not merely an emotion, but a form of spiritual energy that could protect as well as delight, resist as well as celebrate. Venetia's transformation from ordinary trading city to sanctuary for innocence attracted scholars, theologians, and concerned parents from across the known world. The community's success in defending their children provided hope that supernatural predation was not inevitable, while their methods offered practical guidance for others who face similar threats. The empty bottles in the olive grove continued to sing their songs of celebration, creating music that grew more beautiful with each passing season. The sounds attracted not just human visitors but wildlife that had learned to associate the harmonies with safety and peace. The grove became a place where the natural world and human community existed in harmony that reflected the deeper victory that had been achieved through sacrifice and unity. Yet, beneath the celebration and growth that marked Venetia's ongoing prosperity, those who had participated in the battle remembered the costs that protection of innocence could require. Their knowledge of what lay hidden in the world created vigilance that never completely relaxed, while their understanding of what could be achieved through unity provided hope that sustained them through every challenge. The story of the laughter harvester became a teaching tale that parents shared with their children for generations, reminding each new cohort that joy was precious enough to defend and that evil was real enough to require preparation. The legend grew with each telling, but its essential truth remained unchanged. Innocence could be protected, but only through courage, sacrifice, and the recognition that some things were worth any price to preserve. In the end, Giacomo Ridere had achieved the redemption that his cursed existence had made seem impossible. Though his sacrifice had bound him forever to the evil he had contained, his choice to protect rather than harvest had transformed him from servant of darkness into guardian of light. His story served as proof that no one was beyond hope of redemption, while his example inspired others to seek their own paths toward protecting what mattered most. The laughter of Venetia's children echoed through the streets and across the countryside, carrying joy that had been tested by the darkest forces and emerged stronger than before. Their voices created music that celebrated not just happiness, but triumph, not just innocence, but the power of community to protect what was most precious about human existence. The night of final laughter had ended with dawn that brought not just new day, but new understanding of what was possible when ordinary people chose to stand together against extraordinary evil. The victory achieved in Venetia's olive grove would inspire communities throughout the world to recognize that the greatest treasures were worth the greatest sacrifices, and that love could triumph over forces that had seemed invincible. The last laugh, it turned out, belonged to those who chose to protect rather than consume, to serve rather than exploit, and to sacrifice for others rather than demanding sacrifice from them. In the end, that was the only laughter that truly mattered. The joy that survived every test and grew stronger through every trial, creating music that would echo through eternity as proof that goodness could prevail even against the darkest forces the world could produce.